Autumn of 1891 arrived in Millbrook, Kentucky, with a fine rain that transformed dirt roads into treacherous mud pits. Margaret Winslow adjusted the shawl over her shoulders as she looked out the window of her small wooden house. At 26, she was the only Methodist teacher in the region, respected by the community, but always seen as an outsider due to her formal education and progressive ideas. The rain drummed on the roof as Margaret opened the letter that had arrived that morning. The cheap paper was stained with moisture, the trembling handwriting of someone with little education. Dear Miss Winslow, I write with a heavy heart. My daughter Sarah, only 9 years old, was sent to Reverend Holloway's revival camp last spring. He promised Christian education and food on the table, something we couldn't offer after my husband's death. 6 months have passed and we have received no news. When I went to the camp, they said Sarah was never there. But I saw her get on that wagon, Miss Winslow. I saw my girl leave. Mrs. Tanner from across the river says her niece disappeared the same way. And the Callaways lost little James. Please, you are educated and respected. Could you help us find our children? With gratitude, Elizabeth Pearson. Margaret let the letter fall onto the oak table. It wasn't the first time she'd heard rumors about missing children. In recent years, impoverished families had been sending their children to religious camps, hoping they would receive education and sustenance. Many never saw their children again. The next morning, Margaret visited Elizabeth Pearson in her deteriorating cabin on the outskirts of town. The woman, prematurely aged by hard work and suffering, trembled as she spoke of her daughter. Show me some record of her, Mrs. Pearson. Anything that proves Sarah existed. Elizabeth rummaged through a worn wooden box and pulled out a small embroidered handkerchief. She made it herself before leaving. It's all I have. We don't have photographs or a certificate. The local church pastor recorded births, but the old book was lost in a fire 3 years ago. Margaret held the handkerchief, feeling the weight of the absence of evidence. And Reverend Holloway? What do you know about him? He arrived 2 years ago. Speaks as if he had the fire of the Holy Spirit on his tongue. Says he was called to save the souls of the South after the war. People adore him, especially the wealthy in town. They say he has connections in Washington. As she left the cabin, Margaret found Sheriff Buchanan leaning against her wagon, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick mustache and eyes that never revealed his thoughts. He had been the law in Millbrook for more than a decade. Miss Winslow, I heard you're asking questions about Reverend Holloway. I'm investigating the disappearance of children, Sheriff. Be careful what you look for, teacher. These camps save souls. The children were probably sent to adoptive families in the north. Better life than they would have here. Without records, without letters, without goodbyes. The sheriff adjusted the belt where he carried his revolver. Some questions are better left in God's hands, Miss Winslow. This town needs faith, not scandals. That night, Margaret lit the lamp and began writing in her diary. She listed the names she had managed to collect: Sarah Pearson, James Calloway, Emma Tanner. In total, 7 children from Millbrook had disappeared in the last 2 years. A noise on the porch made her stand up. Opening the door, she found only a yellowed envelope. Inside was a newspaper clipping from 1873 from Richmond, Virginia, reporting the disappearance of 12 children from an orphanage after the visit of an itinerant preacher. On the back, written in red ink, "Stop now." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. She looked into the darkness beyond her porch, feeling watched. Something told her that those 7 children from Millbrook were just the tip of a much deeper and darker mystery. Fog covered the hills as Margaret drove her cart along the muddy road toward Reverend Holloway's camp. She had chosen a Tuesday, a day when there would be no services, hoping to find the place less busy. The Holloway Revival Camp was 12 miles from Millbrook, near the Cumberland River, in a clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees. From a distance, it looked like a peaceful place. A large, central white tent, several smaller tents around it, and a wooden cabin that served as the Reverend's residence. Margaret tied her horse to a tree and walked around the perimeter. The silence was disturbing, broken only by the occasional bird song. There was no sign of children or educational activities. "May I help you, miss?" The deep voice startled her. A tall, thin man, approximately 50 years old, with graying hair and penetrating eyes, emerged from behind the main tent. He wore an impeccable black suit, despite the heat and humidity. "I'm Margaret Winslow, the teacher from Millbrook. I'm looking for information about children who were sent to this camp." The man smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Reverend Elijah Holloway at your service. I'm afraid you're mistaken, Miss Winslow. This is a spiritual revival camp, not an orphanage or school. I have reports from families who sent their children here, Reverend, to receive Christian education. Occasionally, families bring their children to services, of course, and we offer words of wisdom to all, but we don't keep children here." Margaret observed the place more carefully. "Then you wouldn't mind if I took a look at the facilities to reassure the worried families?" The Reverend's smile disappeared. "Unfortunately, that's not possible. We are in spiritual preparation for the great revival this weekend. Besides, without meaning to offend you, what you suggest is quite improper. A single woman visiting a religious camp without a proper escort. What would people say? They would say I'm fulfilling my Christian duty to protect the innocent, Reverend." Holloway's eyes hardened. "Miss Winslow, I suggest you return to Millbrook and focus on your own obligations. God does not appreciate those who sow discord and distrust." As they talked, Margaret noticed a young man of about 16 observing them from a distance near the main cabin. When he noticed her gaze, he quickly disappeared inside. "Who is the boy?" "My assistant Ezekiel, an orphan I took in a few years ago. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have duties to attend to." Margaret knew she wouldn't get more information at that moment. As she returned to her cart, she noticed something strange in the soil near the forest, an area where the earth seemed to have been recently disturbed, as if something had been buried and then dug up. On the way back to Millbrook, she stopped at the Tanner property, where Mrs. Tanner confirmed that her niece Emma, 11, had been sent to the camp 8 months earlier. The Reverend said she would be educated to become a ladies' companion for wealthy families in Louisville. He promised she would write, but we never received a word. "Do you have any record of her? A photograph, a document?" Mrs. Tanner shook her head. "My sister died in childbirth. Her husband abandoned her when Emma was 5. We didn't have money for photographs." By nightfall, Margaret returned to her house to find it ransacked. Her books were scattered on the floor, drawers open, and her diary, where she had noted the names of the missing children, was gone. On the wall, written with what appeared to be mud from the river, a message: "Leave the dead in peace." Trembling, Margaret picked up a paper that had fallen under the table. It was a page torn from a record book with a partial list of names and dates. At the top, in elegant calligraphy, "Holloway Camp, Tennessee, 1883. It contained 23 names of children, aged between 7 and 14, and the notation, "Transferred," next to each one. Margaret tucked the paper into her bodice. Someone had left it for her to find, and that someone was taking a great risk. The Louisville Library was an imposing red brick building with white columns and tall windows that let in the autumn light. Margaret had traveled 4 hours by train to get there, determined to discover more about Reverend Holloway and his past. The librarian, a lady with glasses and gray hair tied in a tight bun, looked suspiciously at the young teacher. "Newspapers from Tennessee and Virginia from the last 20 years. That's quite an extensive research, Miss Winslow." "I'm writing a book about religious revival movements after the Civil War," Margaret lied, keeping her voice steady. After hours poring over dusty newspapers, Margaret began to find disturbing patterns. In 1873, a reverend named Elias Howard conducted a revival in Bristol, Tennessee. 6 months later, the local newspaper published a small article about the disappearance of 9 children from poor families in the region. In 1877, a Reverend Elijah Harwood appeared in Roanoke, Virginia. Again, after his departure, reports of missing children. In 1883, it was Elias Hollister in Knoxville. In 1887, Elijah Holcomb in Charleston, West Virginia. Different names, same physical description, same pattern. He would arrive in a community shaken by economic difficulties, establish a revival camp, gain the trust of local families, and leave after a few years. In his wake, missing children and no conclusive investigation. Looking for something specific? The male voice startled her. A middle-aged, well-dressed man with a detective badge pinned to his vest was watching her with curiosity. A Detective Samuel Blackwood, Pinkerton Agency, he introduced himself, sitting down across from her. The librarian mentioned that a young woman was researching patterns of disappearances. Coincidentally, it's a subject that interests me as well. Margaret hesitated, but something in the detective's tired eyes made her trust him. She shared her discoveries, showing the patterns she had identified. Impressive work, Miss Winslow. I've been investigating the disappearance of children at religious camps for 3 years, but I've never been able to connect all these cases. Why is the Pinkerton Agency interested? It's not. This is a personal investigation. My niece disappeared from one of these camps in 1888 in Tennessee. The local police didn't care, just another poor child gone missing. Since then, I've been following leads in my spare time. And what have you discovered? That there's a larger pattern than we imagined. It's not just missing children, they're children who officially never existed. No records, no photographs, no documents. Children from families so poor and marginalized that their absence is barely noticed by the authorities. Blackwood opened his folder and showed Margaret a map of the southern states with small red dots marked in various locations. Each dot represents a location where there were reports of children disappearing after the passage of an itinerant preacher. In total, I estimate that at least 199 children disappeared between 1873 and now. My God, whispered Margaret, and what happened to them? The detective closed the folder. That's the question that keeps me awake at night. I have some theories, none pleasant, but I need concrete evidence before acting. Reverend Holloway is now in Millbrook. If we work together... It's dangerous, Miss Winslow. Whoever is behind this has powerful connections. Politicians, judges, even police officers protect these preachers. Why? Money, power, or something worse? I don't know yet. But be careful. People who asked questions in the past met tragic ends. Before they parted, Blackwood gave Margaret a small diary. It belonged to a teacher like you in Roanoke. She began investigating the disappearances in 1878. She was found dead in her room, supposedly by suicide. I managed to recover this before it was destroyed. On the train back to Millbrook, Margaret read the diary by the dim light of the lamp. The teacher, Catherine Winters, had documented her suspicions about a local reverend and the connection to missing children. Her last notes were disturbing. I found strange marks on the trees near where the children were last seen, symbols that don't seem Christian, but something older. Doctor. Harrison mentioned that the reverend requested large amounts of laudanum for medicinal purposes. Why would a preacher need so much sedative? Last night I heard chanting coming from the forest. They weren't hymns I recognized, but something in Latin, perhaps older. Tomorrow I intend to visit the abandoned cabin where they say the Reverend conducted special studies with the selected children. This was the last entry. On the next page, only an ink stain, as if the pen had fallen from Catherine's hand. Upon arriving in Millbrook, it was already night. Margaret found her house dark. When she lit the lamp, she realized she wasn't alone. Miss Winslow, said Sheriff Buchanan, sitting in her rocking chair, we need to talk about your recent activities. Sheriff Buchanan slowly twirled his hat between his fingers, observing Margaret with a look she couldn't decipher. I was in Louisville today, he said calmly. Curious to find you there, talking to a Pinkerton detective. Margaret felt her blood freeze. Were you following me, Sheriff? Let's say I have an interest in your recent movements. especially when they involve serious accusations against a respected man like Reverend Holloway. I haven't made public accusations. I'm just investigating the disappearance of children." Buchanan stood up, his imposing figure filling the small room. "Miss Winslow, I came to warn you as a friend. This investigation of yours, it's not healthy for you or for Millbrook. Children have disappeared, Sheriff. Don't you think that deserves an investigation?" "What I think," he said, approaching, "is that a single young woman should worry about her reputation. People are commenting on your eccentric behavior, your visits to families of ill repute, your unaccompanied travels. Are you threatening me? I'm offering you advice. Millbrook needs a respectable teacher. If you continue down this path, the school board may reconsider your position." After the sheriff left, Margaret couldn't sleep. His words were clearly a threat, but they also confirmed her suspicions. Something wrong was happening, and powerful people were involved. The next morning, Margaret received an unexpected visit. Ezekiel, Reverend Holloway's young assistant, was standing on her porch, nervously looking in all directions. "I need to speak with you," he said in a low voice. "But not here. It's dangerous." They met an hour later in a clearing in the forest halfway between the town and the camp. Ezekiel looked even younger in daylight, with deep circles under his eyes and hands that wouldn't stop trembling. "I was the one who left that registry page for you to find," he confessed. "I know what the Reverend does with the children." "What does he do, Ezekiel?" The boy swallowed hard. "He selects them carefully. Always children without official records, from families so poor they can barely feed them. He promises education, food, a better future. And then? The first weeks are normal. The children receive food, clean clothes, learn to read passages from the Bible. Then, the Reverend selects some for special studies. He says they were chosen by God for a greater purpose." Ezekiel paused, struggling with the words. "He takes them to a cabin at the back of the property. There he teaches them strange chants, makes them memorize texts that aren't in the Bible. He gives them a tea that makes them drowsy and obedient. You saw this happen. I was one of those children 7 years ago, but the Reverend found me useful. Said I had a different purpose. I became his assistant, helping to attract other children." Tears streamed down the boy's face. "I didn't know what happened to them afterward. I only knew they disappeared, and the Reverend said they had been sent to families in the north." "When did you discover the truth?" 3 nights ago. I woke up to strange noises. The Reverend and some men from town were digging something up near the creek. When they left, I went to check. I found remains, small bones, Miss Winslow. Children's bones." Margaret felt nauseous. "We need to go to the police. The sheriff is involved. I saw him there that night, helping to move the remains. They're transferring everything because someone is asking questions. You're asking questions. Why are you telling me this, Ezekiel? Why now?" "Because I'm tired of carrying this sin, and because I heard the Reverend and the sheriff talking about you. They're planning something. We need to find evidence before it's too late." Ezekiel explained that the Reverend kept a special book bound in black leather where he recorded all the children who passed through the camp, including their final purposes. He keeps it locked in his cabin in a secret compartment under the floorboards. If we can get that book, we'll have evidence for federal authorities. How can we obtain it? The Reverend will be in town tomorrow night for a dinner at the mayor's house. It will be our only chance. Biggies. When Ezekiel left, Margaret sat down to write a letter to Detective Blackwood, detailing everything she had discovered and her plans for the next night. If something happened to her, at least the truth wouldn't die. That night, she dreamed of 199 nameless children, their silent voices begging to be remembered. Night fell over Millbrook like a heavy cloak. A fine rain began to fall when Margaret met Ezekiel at the edge of the forest that led to the camp. The boy carried a covered lantern and moved like a frightened animal, startling at every noise from the forest. "The Reverend left an hour ago," he whispered, "but we must be quick. Sometimes he returns earlier than expected." They walked in silence along the muddy trail. The camp seemed deserted, the tent swaying slightly with the damp breeze. Reverend Holloway's cabin was the only permanent structure, a solid wooden construction with a front porch and windows covered by dark curtains. "Is no one watching?" asked Margaret. "The Reverend trusts in his status. Who would dare invade a man of God's property?" They entered through the back door, which Ezekiel opened with a key he kept hidden. The interior of the cabin was surprisingly luxurious. Carved wooden furniture, Persian rugs, a bookshelf filled with leather-bound books. A large crucifix dominated the main wall, but Margaret noticed something strange at its base. Symbols she didn't recognize. Definitely not Christian. "There!" Ezekiel pointed to a rug near the desk. "The compartment is under the floorboards." They moved the rug aside, revealing carefully aligned wooden boards. Ezekiel pressed one of them, which moved to reveal a small lever. When he pulled it, several boards lifted, exposing a secret compartment. Inside were various items: a black leather-bound book, flasks containing dark liquids, small fabric bags tied with cords, and a carved wooden box with the same strange symbols that Margaret had seen at the base of the crucifix. "This is the book," said Ezekiel, taking the leather-bound volume. Margaret opened it with trembling hands. The first pages contained lists of names, dates, and locations, organized chronologically from 1873. Each name had notes about age, physical condition, and suitability. Next to many names was the word "completed," written in red ink. In the following pages, they found detailed drawings of archaic symbols and texts in Latin and other languages that Margaret didn't recognize. There were diagrams of ritual circles and descriptions of ceremonies that made her stomach turn. "My God," she whispered, "this isn't Christianity. It's some kind of pagan cult." "The Reverend always talked about the ancient way and powers before the cross," said Ezekiel. "He said the children were pure vessels, necessary for the ritual." Margaret continued flipping through the book until she reached the most recent pages. There she found the names of the Millbrook children: Sarah Pearson, James Calloway, Emma Tanner, all marked as "in preparation." "They're still alive," she said, feeling a spark of hope. "Where does he keep them?" "There's a cave about a mile from here following the creek. That's where he performs the final rituals." A noise from outside made both of them freeze. Footsteps on the porch, the sound of male voices. "He's back," whispered Ezekiel, terror evident on his face. "And he's not alone." Margaret quickly tore out the most incriminating pages from the book and hid them in her bodice, along with the letter to Blackwood. They returned the book to the compartment and closed it, but there was no time to replace the rug. "Through the back window," Ezekiel indicated. As they headed there, the front door opened. Reverend Holloway entered, accompanied by Sheriff Buchanan and the mayor of Millbrook. "I assure you, gentlemen, that this year's ceremony will be the most powerful yet. With 7 purified vessels, our circle will finally be complete." The 3 men stopped abruptly upon seeing the rug moved aside and the secret compartment exposed. "It seems we have visitors," said Holloway, his calm voice contrasting with the fury in his eyes. Margaret and Ezekiel ran to the back window. The boy managed to get out first, but when Margaret tried to follow him, she felt strong hands grabbing her ankles. "Miss Winslow," said the sheriff, pulling her back inside. What a disappointment. Ezekiel hesitated outside, looking at Margaret with desperation. "Run!" she shouted. "Find Detective Blackwood!" The boy disappeared into the darkness as Margaret was dragged back into the cabin. "A pity," said Reverend Holloway, observing her with a cold smile. "I had hopes that an educated woman like you would understand the importance of our work. Murdering innocent children. What kind of work is that?" "It's not murder, my dear. It's transcendence. Each child serves a greater purpose than their insignificant lives could ever achieve." The mayor seemed nervous. "Elijah, we should get rid of her quickly. If what you say about this detective is true..." "Calm yourself, Thomas. Miss Winslow will accompany us tonight. In fact, she arrived at quite an opportune moment. We needed a conscious adult to complete the circle. Margaret felt her blood freeze. The children, where are they? In preparation, as you must have read in my book, tonight is special, Miss Winslow. The autumn equinox, when the veil between worlds is thinnest, a perfect night for our ritual. The sheriff tied Margaret's hands while the Reverend prepared a flask with dark liquid. A little laudanum to calm your nerves during the journey, he said, bringing the flask to Margaret's lips. She turned her face away, resisting. What kind of man of God are you? Holloway laughed, a cold sound without humor. God? The God you know is just a pale shadow of the ancient powers. We serve something much older and much more powerful. They forced the liquid down her throat. Margaret tasted bitterness and felt an immediate numbness spreading through her body. Her vision began to blur, but before losing consciousness, she saw the Reverend leaning over her, his eyes reflecting the lamplight like those of a predator in the night.